Hi, I'm Chris Naniga, the Director of Training Development at SwiftOtter, and you're watching a free lesson from our BigCommerce Front-end Foundations training course, the most extensive and in-depth learning experience available to turn you into an expert on BigCommerce's default front-end framework. If you like what you see in this lesson, see below for the link to the full course. In this lesson, we're going to talk about evaluation context in Handlebars. Evaluation context is what determines what dynamic values, what variable names are available to you at various points in your templates to use in your Handlebars expressions. There is a top-level context that would be the context right when rendering starts in the entry point for a particular page that has whatever values, whatever variables have been passed in by BigCommerce to the Stencil engine. Again, we will inspect that a little more closely later, but the important thing to understand is that there are certain things that can change the context and change how to reference values or what values are available to you at a given point. We touched on this just briefly when we first looked at loops and looked at how the each expression or helper is used for looping through data. So here's that same example again. We have a source with a variable called items that stores an array of objects, and then in our template we're using the each helper to iterate through items. So at that context where the each helper occurs, we have a value available to us called items, but then you can see that the context changes within the loop. Once we start looping, once we're inside that helper's wrapping tags, the context is now the individual object, each object in that loop, and the variable references are different. Now the references are directly to the properties on each of those objects. In this context, we wouldn't even be able to reference a value called items anymore because the context has changed. This is the first example that we have of changing context, but there are several others. Now, before we move on, I do just want to point out that in any context you're in, you do have access to a special variable called this, just like you would expect in many programming languages, that can be used to reference the context itself. So let's just look at an example of what I mean by that. If instead of an array of objects, we imagine that we have an array of strings, like you see here, then inside our template, when we're looping through that items array, we can use the value this to reference just the current context. So the context we're in within that loop is the item in the loop itself, and in this case that is just a string, so we're using this to reference that string and render that in our template. There's a built-in Handlebars helper called with that basically allows you to explicitly change context in some segment of your template, which is something that can be useful in certain circumstances to reduce the verbosity of your dynamic references. I'll show you what I mean. So here I have a product page in my local environment, and I'm just going to kind of throw some content on here to test some expressions. Here's the product page template. I'm here in templates, pages, product, and I'm just going to pick a place near the top of the main body to throw some test content in. I'll just put a heading in there so it's clear where that is on the page. And I'm just going to throw in a couple of values from the product object. So on the product page, at the top level context, we have access to an object called product. And I'm going to just output the title and the SKU. But really, the technique I'm demonstrating would be helpful if we were referencing a lot more values than this from the same object in our context. So with that in place, we just have this, the name of the product, parentheses, and the SKU. And what the with helper will do is something like this. If I wanted to wrap this entire snippet of content in this helper expression with product, then that essentially just says everything inside this block helper has the context of whatever object I passed it. So this is the same as we were seeing in a loop when we were looping through an array, and then in each iteration of that loop, the object served as the context. Now everything within this can simply be references like this. Product is the context, and we can directly reference the properties just like that. And so we should see the same thing unchanged here on our page. Another case where context can change is when one template is being injected into another. Now, typically, or just by default, injecting a template doesn't change the context. So just as kind of a initial test expression here, if I was injecting a component, and we'll just call it my component, injecting a component like this with no further arguments being given to this, then the context within that template that I'm injecting here would be exactly the same as the context where I injected it. But we also can pass a parameter to this expression to change the context. So I'm going to get rid of this with block here, and then we're going to do this. Inside this, I'm going to inject my component, and then as a parameter, I'm going to pass product into that. And then we're just going to take this content that I had and put it into that component. So here in components, I'll just create the file my component. And then basically the result of this is going to be exactly the same as that with block that we had, only using template injection instead. So we've moved that into its own component. We still have those references just directly to properties in the content of this component, and we are passing in a parameter saying that this is the context for that component. The context is product. So let's just make sure that we got the same result. So everything still looks exactly the same in there. If we didn't have that parameter being passed to it, the context in the template being injected is the same as the context here, and so I should, yeah, there we go, I have no content now since we have those direct property references. If I weren't injecting that custom context, then I could continue to reference my values with the same context as the parent template, just like that. So that's how that works with passing a context to components or to other templates that you're injecting. Now you can also pass named parameters as context parameters to a template injection, like you see being done here. And so that works a little differently. When named parameters are being passed in, essentially that's adding a value to the context available within that child template, within the injected template. So here's another example here. This reviews component is being injected in, and these context parameters are being passed in. Reviews with the value that's being passed to reviews, and the value that's being passed to product is in fact product. That's not strictly necessary because the child template is still going to have the same context as the parent template otherwise, other than whatever named values you're adding. So something like this, product equals product, isn't actually necessary. But in this component, reviews, we should see references to a context parameter called reviews. Let's find that. So it's products, reviews, and then if we look through here, we should find, well, that's not very helpful in a component called reviews, but here's a reference to it right here, reviews total. So it obviously expects a value called reviews in here, and that's being passed in by name. Everything else about the context, like I said, is going to be the same as the parent context. So that child template could reference any other values that would normally be available just like normal. Let's look at kind of a combined example just to really drive home how this works. So here's an example of some fun data that we might have in a variable, some blog articles by our favorite fictional characters in a value called blog posts. We could loop through this in a template just like this with the each helper, looping through blog posts, and you can see here I'm injecting another template and giving it a named parameter called post, and in this case I can just pass that value referring to the current object in the loop, or the current context, pass that in as post, so that in the child template, the blog post template, we should expect to be able to reference values like this. We have a post object that was passed in with the title and the author. So that's just a quick example of how these different context switches can actually be used in combination. The last concept that we should cover here in relation to context is the syntax for accessing parent context. And to show you what I mean here, I'm going to throw another little example, this time on the category page, because I'm going to use the category's products to have a looping context. here in my category template, I'm just going to throw some content here. Again, I'm just going to make it obvious where that is on my page. And then I'm going to loop through the products in this category. So in this context, I have a category object. Oh, we need an each here. Category object that has a property called products. I'm going to loop through those. Whoops, each. And I'm just going to start out with the name of the product. So within this loop, we have a new context. It's the product object itself. So I'm just directly referencing the name property there. That just gives us something like this, bulleted list with the name of each product. But let's say that within this new context, in this case, the context within the loop, I want to reference something other than properties on the product object. Let's say I wanted to reference this category value again. So now my context has changed. I'm in a more kind of focused context. How would I access that? So let's say that I want something like this from, and then I want the category name here. I can't do this anymore because category is not a value in the context that I'm in the loop, but I can use this syntax to tell Handlebars I'm going up a context. So this is saying I want to access a value from the parent context, the one that was that was the context before we switched. So if I reference the value like that, then that should work in my page. There's a product name from garden. Of course, that's what they're all going to say. It's the same category, and you can use that context or that syntax to go up multiple levels of context as well. If you are, say, inside a loop in a template that itself was injected with a new context, like if you have different context switches for various reasons and you're kind of nested in, you can use this syntax to go however many levels of context up. That will work just fine. So that's evaluation context in Handlebars. It's pretty simple, but you just want to make sure that you're familiar with the different ways context can change so that doesn't trip you up when you're trying to access values in your templates.